The VR Report podcast with David Jean O.
Hey, what's up, fam? This is David O from the VR Report. I want to introduce my guest, Julian Park, the CEO and founder of Bezel. It's a 3D tool to help you visualize your applications, but mostly used for people in the XR industry. Think of it like Figma, but for people designing in for XR. Julian, how are you today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, David. I'm
Fantastic.
super excited to chat about Bezel and learn more about what everyone thinks as well.
Cool. Did I give a fair introduction to yourself? Maybe you can do a better job of giving me your origin story.
Yeah, no, I think that was great. As you noted, I'm the co-founder and CEO at Bezel, a collaborative 3D design tool. Previously worked at Oculus for about 3 or 4 years, just kind of building out the OS that goes inside the Quest headsets. So all the way from Quest 1, Quest 2, and so on. Now we have the Quest 3. I didn't get to work on that directly. And during that time, I worked a lot with designers. And designers would use tools like Figma to iterate on how the apps would look inside the OS as those panel apps kind of float around you in VR. But whenever they would bring these designs to meetings, we would quickly realize, obviously this is a 2D canvas and we need to visualize how these things would look in 3D. And that was just a really difficult transition for a lot of people, because if you did want to see how it looks in 3D, then you would have to partner with a developer to really build out an interactive Unity prototype, which would take a lot more time to just build out. So that's what gave the idea for Bezel. It's just a much easier way to design and prototype 3D experiences that can also be directly consumed on XR devices.
Yeah, what I really love about Bezel is that anyone with a design background, or maybe someone that wants to design something in XR, whether they're designing for augmented reality or virtual reality, you actually allow a lot of those presets just out of the box to just start working, which is pretty awesome. Can you describe, Julian, how Bezel has evolved from its conception? Because you had mentioned a need that you thought needed solving while you were working at Oculus. Can you kind of walk us through what were the major milestones that shaped the current form of Bezel where it's at today?
Yeah, so it really began as a small idea. And a very simple prototype of Bezel was basically a cube that would float in the center of the browser screen, and then multiple people will be able to view the cube and then change the color, and then the color change would propagate between these people in the same browser window. And getting there was relatively straightforward, but from there, just building out a whole production app just took a lot more time and effort. And we now have a team of 9, just all incredibly talented and really working hard on this one editor and this general product. But it took some time. So it started off with that prototype where it really was just one cube. You couldn't really do much inside that. But eventually we got to a point where you could also start to drag in images. So people would drag in Figma frames so they could visualize that in spatial devices. And from there on, we added a lot more sort of the design utility functionalities inside the editor so that you can create more native designs. We spent a lot more time on the prototyping aspect. So the state machine, where you can add different states to different objects and have pointer events and interact with them in VR or just on your desktop screen as well, so that you're able to quickly ideate. When you have an idea for something in 3D, you're then able to quickly get it to something you can share with your teammates.
I really love the collaborative nature of Bezel in the sense that I can actually comment and give notes to other designers or team members to change maybe the surface texture, or maybe to add in specific different assets. What was that aha moment for you, knowing that this is a tool that most people need today versus some of the other tools that are out there to help visualize in 3D?
Yes. So, in terms of collaboration, this is a trend that's been happening for a long time, across the productivity tools suite, right? So, I mean, even something like Google Docs, which is, I mean, it's been quite some time now, but I'm sure you might remember the first time using something like Google Docs and thinking, oh, I don't have to email a Microsoft Word document anymore. It's just a link that we can just collaborate on. Let me just invite some of my teammates and we have one source of truth. And I saw this mechanism being applied to all sorts of different areas, across industries. So for 2D UI design, that was Figma, which kind of paved the way forward for like what UI design would look like, from a collaborative sense. And there are also now like collaborative video editors out there, and also more collaborative like workspaces. And so the the idea of taking something to be collaborative in a 3D space, to me, was unavoidable. Long term, if we put ourselves forward a decade, I couldn't imagine myself not having a collaborative 3D canvas that I could create with other people. So, I think it was inevitable in my mind, and from day one, we built Bezel to be collaborative in both real time, so like more synchronous, sort of the flying cursor analogy, but also asynchronous, so like being able to pinpoint a specific XYZ position inside the 3D space and leave a comment there, so that anyone else who jumps into that file in the future can check it out and create a thread in there as well. So all your feedback is now contained in this one 3D editor, without having to like take screenshots and like send it over Slack and exchange comments elsewhere.
Yeah, I think that's super cool in the sense that most tools today, like you had mentioned, there's video editing software that is more collaborative. Obviously, Adobe has a suite that has been doing that. There seems to be a theme, especially with what you're building with Bezel, to be more collaborative in the building process. That seems to be like a new way for building software. Do you think that's a trend that is just part of the evolution, or do you think that's just a special use case? What's your point of view on that?
Yeah, I think it's part of a bigger trend where the center of gravity in the creative process is shifting from more development to more design. And what I mean by that is, over time, you could spend, in the past, you could spend like the majority of your creative process in the production phase of like, you have an idea, and you need to like implement it. You got to like bring it to life, render it, and like kind of show it to people to get the idea across. But nowadays, I would say the majority of the creative process is actually spent in the ideation and the design process, as opposed to the manual, production implementation process. I mean, one good example of this is like Midjourney or DALL-E, kind of putting, just the 2D generation of imagery to the extreme, where it's like 95% ideation and like 5%, production, right? And so this is a pattern that we've been seeing across different companies too. And even in the sort of the app design world, you have companies just transitioning the developer to designer ratio, right? In the past, there were a lot more developers for every designer at these tech companies, but now it's just it's more equalizing, because companies are realizing that designers actually have a lot of power and say into how the product works.
That is really fascinating. What you just broke down was this new paradigm of, especially with Gen AI into the fold, most of the time as we evolve is spent in ideation, the concept. What is the concept that you want to communicate, that you want the user to feel or to, be part of? And the execution now is almost streamlined in the sense that it can be done in a blink of an eye with Gen AI. That's really cool. Do you see Gen AI influencing Bezel in its current form, and how do you see Gen AI actually helping the designer build for 3D experiences?
Yeah, 100%. I think Gen AI will be able to bring a lot more value to both people in the 3D industry today, as well as people outside of it who want to jump in and participate. And the reason is it's just going to speed up so much of the manual, like 3D modeling and sculpting aspect of the creative process. So when people think about like 3D art or like 3D design today, they think of like vertices, edges, faces, like polygonal modeling and like, nerves and just kind of like sculpting this thing. But a lot of that, at least in like 2D worlds, are being solved through Gen AI, where it's like, oh, you don't have to like illustrate in Photoshop or some other tool to like create a picture of a background on a green mountain. It's now just a text command that generates that background image for you, which they become assets that you can then bring into a design tool like Figma to use for a broader UX design. And I think a similar analogy will play into the 3D world where, you could generate like, different 3D assets, but that still calls for a composition tool like Bezel for you to bring these assets into a shared space that you can then use to like create, design, iterate, and prototype an experience that you can kind of share with your teammates. So whether, you're building out a game for a 3D platform or even like an app for the upcoming Quest 3 or the Vision Pro as well.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning the Quest 3. I mean, that was a recent announcement. Quest 3 now has color pass-through. It's lighter. They also announced some capability features like inside-out body tracking. What features are you most excited about, and you plan to have Bezel support them by optimizing the platform to cater to these capabilities?
Yeah, I'm just first of all super excited about the Quest 3. I think it's a huge jump beyond the capabilities of the Quest 2. I mean, the Quest 2 really was a huge moment for the broader sort of AR VR industry, as a whole, where it truly brought a more mass adoption of like VR headsets that could be used. But I think the Quest 3 really takes it to a whole new level of just performance improvements in general too, beyond all the content that they've shared. So I'm super excited, and I think that this has huge implications for how Bezel will also work with this new set of hardware. For example, as you mentioned, color pass-through I think will be very important, especially when coupled with like spatial anchors, where you can now sort of paste content, digital content, on top of physical walls or sort of planes that you have around your room. I think these are going to be like an open field for a lot more app experiences or even games to kind of come in and like kind of pioneer how this user experience would work on this new platform. So I'm personally very excited for what people will create. Obviously, Bezel will be able to support this workflow for people to quickly ideate and like quickly prototype something before they commit to building something on a game engine, like Unity as an example. So I'm just really excited to see how better performance allows for more detailed like textures, for example, like inside content, and just more room for people to explore different usability options.
That's cool. I think Bezel solves the problem of not having to do Unity development, right? Like I want to be able to prototype something quickly. Yeah. I don't want to take some time off my developer because they're also busy building. And it allows you out the box to then include your own templates. Let's say, for example, designing for Apple Vision Pro. They already Apple provides you some of their spatial kit to give you some layouts of a living room, kitchen, but Bezel kind of takes that on hyperdrive. You can incorporate those layouts, but then you can actually incorporate, specific customization that you would need for that user to incorporate. Like in my kitchen, I want, a certain type of layout that would be helpful to other designers designing for that type of space. What do you see now with Apple into the mix? Because I see Bezel influencing a lot of the capabilities to help design for that headset. How do you see Apple Vision Pro influencing the spatial computing arena? And how does Bezel have any particular strategies in place to support those features of the Apple Vision Pro?
Yeah. I think the Apple Vision product line is going to be one of the most influential computing product lines in the history of mankind. Where they came out with the Macintosh in 1984, which, by the way, was actually a lot more expensive than people might think or might remember from this point. Because I know the Vision Pro is coming in at a pretty high price that gets people to talk about it. But the Macintosh originally, I believe, was extremely expensive, especially when adjusted for inflation. So that kind of kickstarted the personal computing era, right? Like now everyone had a computer at home on their desk. And then I think the next big shift was 2007 when the iPhone was announced and sort of kickstarted the wave of mobile computing. These days you can't travel around the world and not notice people staring at their phones all day. And I think that is a natural consequence of the technology, of course, but also the behavior and the content available for people to use their phones for. And I think, with 2023 kind of opening up this world of spatial computing, I think the same requirements still exist, where you still need a diverse array of content to compel people to put on this headset in the first place. As many of the listeners here might agree, the friction of putting on a headset is a lot higher than just holding up your phone and just kind of scrolling on your screen, or just like opening your laptop screen and just kind of like working on it, right? Like just putting on a headset is a lot more intentional of a behavioral action. So I think that essentially what needs to happen is the compelling content needs to compensate for that activation energy. And I think the Vision Pro, Apple's ecosystem of all its apps and brands that ship on their platform is going to help with that content problem. That's going to allow a lot more people to come in and ease into the spatial computing era from all the 2D apps that they're familiar with.
Yeah, I think Apple's strategy is to focus on the current ecosystem iOS apps, because you can tell like some of their labs, they're asking you, hey, which applications have you built already on our ecosystem? And they're kind of playing favorites to, of course, iOS apps that would actually transition really well in spatial computing. And it kind of makes sense, right? Why try to start over, considering that you already have that rich ecosystem already involved? And
yeah,
Apple took a different approach too. It's more of a 2.5D. I don't know if that's fair to say, but it's not fully immersive VR, even though they have all the hooks. And technically, you can be fully immersed VR, but they're choosing more of this mixed reality type of experience to take some of their existing 2D applications and kind of give it spatial computing. And I see a lot of things that are happening with Bezel that kind of help supports those type of designers. What other features do you think are you going to capitalize on to make sure people who are making that transition from, iOS apps to spatial computing, what is the focus there for Bezel?
Yeah, on the topic of a lot of the Vision OS apps looking 2.5D, I think it speaks to two reasons in my mind. So the first thing being, there is a familiarity to seeing content in 2D, just from the perspective of like the human mind, where like text is easier to read and it's more legible when it's flat on screen. You probably don't want 3D text kind of floating around. And paper, right? It's like we read books, and they're all sort of 2D planes. But on the other hand, I also think this is somewhat of a transient transition period, because you might remember when the iPad first came out, a lot of the initial wave of apps were sort of iOS, like iPhone ported apps that were kind of small screens in the center of the iPad that you would zoom out and became like pixelated to take up the whole screen. So I think that's something that the iPad ecosystem had to beat through. And I think the Vision OS ecosystem will now need to evolve beyond just the ported over like iPad apps that it uses, but rather incorporates wisely and intentionally a lot of the 3D aspects. Whether it's like an e-commerce app that visualizes 3D objects in front of the user, or any other app that makes use of spatial content. So And I do think over time, several years at least, that apps are going to become more and more 3D. And I think on that note, Bezel is well equipped to allow people to explore their minds in 3D and see how a traditionally 2D app experience could turn into a 3D experience. I think that's going to be a really exciting time for designers and product designers, especially because it just opens up a whole new field of people to try out new usage patterns for this new platform. And I think that being said, UI design will still continue to be an important part of digital products. So Bezel's definitely going to keep pushing on that side as well.
Yeah, I think that's really cool in the sense that you're designing or at least gearing up for the Apple Vision Pro because it works really seamlessly in Figma. So, I do just do some 2D UI design work. I can just incorporate a link from Figma. It goes right in automatically, or it's in Bezel. And then what you're saying is, hey, now that you can incorporate like UI elements, for example, you probably want to think spatially. So with that UI menu, what can complement from a 3D icon or a 3D button that actually goes along with that menu, and how does that relate? And I think that's really important to understand what spatial computing is about. You kind of touched upon this before. I read some of your other content regarding 3D technology and spatial computing, but it adds a whole other dimension from 2D to 3D, and that gives you so many different possibilities. But then there's also that sense of collaboration, which we touched upon, and that's something that Bezel does really well. It's one of your most distinguishing features. But can you delve deeper into the challenges faced when implementing something like social and collaboration? How do you go about thinking about that when designing and prototyping in VR?
Yeah, I think, from the perspective of multiplayer collaboration in Bezel, there are both technical challenges, but also just like product UX challenges. So, on the technical front, as you might expect, 3D cursors are a bit more complex than 2D cursors because you can't just project your, people's cursors, the XY position on a 2D screen and expect that people viewing the same canvas from a different camera angle will like magically, be in the same space. So there's a lot more math and a lot more sort of server side calculation and sort of technical implementations we have to go through. And I think that took up a chunk of time for us to really get it right. I mean, if you try out Bezel today with different people, I think we're at a point where it's like it feels pretty fluid to have different 3D cursors in the same file. So I'm super proud of the team for getting here today. And also on the product UX challenges, we really wanted to strike a good balance between presence but also not going too hard into like having avatars in your design file and like making it a whole social like gathering experience, because those are very different situations and scenarios that you want to be in. And we wanted to make sure that it's bare bones enough that you don't feel like when you're in a 3D file together that you're like in a social game. So we kept things pretty minimal on that side, and also made sure that it still feels fun. And I think that striking that balance where people perceive the experience to not be too social, but not like too bland. I think that was the main challenge for Bezel.
How do you find that balance? Is it through user testing and then seeing how people internally experience the app, and then or platform, and then also getting external feedback? How do you find that sweet spot? What is that design process to get things greenlit at Bezel?
Yeah, so I think it always starts with the creator's intent, and the creator being the people in the Bezel team today, just kind of thinking about how the experience should work. Before we even get to any like user research sessions or testing sessions or data on how people use it, or like A/B testing, like all that kind of stuff, we really want to start with a crisp understanding of how the product should work and what our opinion is on what the product should be doing. And from there, that forms a basis for what we're building with a clear vision. And when we ship that, of course, there are times when like people don't use it the way we wanted it to or expected it to in the first place. But responding to feedback from that angle, I think is a much better space than like just kind of taking a lot of the debt of like user feedback on the latter half of the product development cycle, because the first half is the most important part, in my opinion, where you get to really think through how it should be working. Because I see a lot of people on the other extreme of product development processes where it's like, you know what, I'm just going to start with a hacky sort of something quick and just get it out there and just get it started, which is also a valid approach. But I think that could lead to a lot more confusion or bugs or errors or a lot more unnecessary discussions you have to have and on that note. So I think, again, it kind of comes back to a balance that I think the team has to strike.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of things regarding friction points, even between the internal teams of what to do next, right? And you've previously mentioned in another interview I watched is that there's a need for a bridge between platforms. You mentioned that a bridge between laptops and VR headsets are needed. And how does Bezel plan to further streamline the experience for developers and designers by making sure there is a bridge? What is your philosophy on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the bridge is already what people expect. I don't think I'm coming in with like a whole new radical idea of like wanting a bridge between the desktop and like VR headsets. I think we as a society kind of developed this habit already through like the desktop and phones, for example, right? Like it will be very weird if content isn't shared between desktop and phones. Like if Slack messages are only on desktop, but like different messages on the phone, for example, or even if it's like the creation process where if you're designing for a website, you probably want to make it responsive, so it's also working on the phone screens. So this concept of interoperability to me was always there for computing. It's just different form factors of how immersed you want to be in the content consumption area. So to me, like AR VR devices are just a more immersive way of experiencing content that should also be accessible through the devices that we're already using day to day, like the computer that's that's in front of a lot of people's desks today. So I think going from that angle, it also speaks to why we built Bezel the way we built Bezel, is that we wanted a shared bridge layer, a shared connective tissue that creates content for both the desktop but also the VR headsets.
That's cool, because most of the experience of Bezel is on the desktop, like any good builder or developer. You're not actually publishing and building an app in something like VR because the capabilities just may not be there for that designer. So that's really the core of what Bezel is doing. Yeah.
Right. I think so. And I think it also leaves more room for Bezel to also grow in the future. Because, for example, you wouldn't expect game engines like Unity or Unreal to, be created like inside or authored inside the headset. Like there's just a whole another level of intensity and sort of desktop level focus that you would need to get something creative out. That I think in today's hardware, when you're put on your headset, it's just not something that you would be able to spend like many hours in consecutively.
Yeah, that makes sense. And of course, something like Unreal and Unity, there's such a investment, even to try to prototype something, that's time away from another deliverable. So I definitely see a need for Bezel filling in that gap. Speaking of Unreal and Unity, that was recent news, right? With Unity giving new terms of services in terms of their pricing structure, which caused an uproar with the development community. Tim Sweeney just recently talked about layoffs, unfortunately, but also a new pricing structure. What does this news mean to Bezel, and how are you thinking about this, just from a personal standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main takeaway for me was that this is going to let a whole new wave of creatives now explore different tools like Bezel beyond expensive game engine tools. And when I say expensive, it's not just financial. It's actually the time, the learning curve, the sort of the compilation, the packaging process, and all the associated costs around that workflow. So, and I think being able to quickly design and prototype something using something like Bezel is just, it has a different purpose in the creative pipeline than something like a production game engine, which that has its purpose too in a lot of scenarios. So I think this is just offering more options and more benefits for the user ultimately to decide which tool to use for which occasion.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Like game development or XR development relies heavily on game engines, right? And game engines, nobody wants to build in a game engine because it just takes so much resources when they can, license something. But at the same time, no other IT industry has been, I guess, monopolized by several key players in the industry, right? So I think this recent news is a wake-up call for developers to understand that, hey, actually, you're building it upon a license of a game engine. It's not necessarily 100% your game. I think that was the big slap on the wrist where people understood, like, oh, this is not my game. And then second, in terms of understanding what options there are, right? You've heard on the Twitter sphere people talking about, wow, I think as a Unity developer, I'll check out Unreal. But what you're saying is really valid. Like, hey, Bezel and all these other type of tools gives other people the option to give more diversity and hopefully implementing things that are more efficient for their workload. So I couldn't agree more on that. You have a background where you went to UC Berkeley, you worked at Oculus. What was your kind of personal path, let's say from Berkeley days to working at Oculus to a startup founder? What was that path?
Yeah. So in college, I took a computer graphics class, CS 184, I still remember. And I think it was just the most exciting and fascinating class I took within the computer science program. Because it offered me a new way of looking at how the world works, like in a way where it's like how nature renders itself. Because when we look outside the world, we don't think about, oh, that tree is going to be heavy for the rendering, in this world. Like it's just there in physics. And I think in computer graphics, there's a whole history of problem solving and optimization that had to be done in terms of how much data and visual quality can you fit into the hardware you're working with. And that's been the study of it really for a long time. And nowadays, hardware is getting better. There are new ways to like optimize assets and stuff like that. But I think learning about that and thinking about how privileged we are in the physical world versus the virtual world, where you have to be a lot more careful about what you show in front of the user's eyes. That problem to me was very interesting, and I knew that over time, because digital content is becoming more and more important than some of the physical content we see, in physical life. I knew this was going to be something that had a lot of innovation happening over the years. So, I went deeper there, and that kind of got me into VR and working at Oculus after college. And I think at Oculus, I just learned so much from all these industry veterans and just people mentoring me to become a better engineer as well. I learned a lot from my mentors there, and also just how products ship. And I think a lot of the lessons I learned at Facebook helped me kind of have the courage and the idea of just being able to start something new. And so, yeah, a lot of things from the past helped me get here.
That's cool. Leaving Facebook must have been a big decision. What was the most challenging aspect of transitioning to become a founder? And do you regret it?
not having free meals anymore. Maybe that, maybe that was one thing. Um, no, I think that does speak to some truth because people are taken care of really well at established tech companies. And when you leave, it's a new look on life because you're not so bound or taken care of by an external entity, and you really have to like figure out a way to like do what you want to do, but also just having the courage to start something that a lot of people are going to say, hey, I don't know if that's going to work out. Like, so why are you doing that again? Like these are all questions that I've personally heard as well. And yeah, I mean, I think like it might sound cliche, but life is short. I think there are a lot of things that people could be doing, but just because of a level of fear, that they might not be taking the leap of faith to get it done. And I think in general, people tend to overestimate the worst case scenarios that could happen when you do take a leap of faith. Usually it doesn't end up that bad because worst case, you can find a new job in the future too. So but that's just kind of how I looked at it.
Yeah, a lot of professionals struggle with the concept between a stable, high-paying job, free food, compared to chasing their dreams. What advice do you give new founders to strike a balance, the right balance, between the two, between passion and compensation?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that there's no shortcut, around the risk that you would have to take to genuinely pursue something that you're passionate about, right? Like, there's no job where you decide everything that you want to work on and also have it, highly compensated, because there's nothing to compensate because you're doing what you want to do.
Yeah.
I think for me, at least, the way I think about it is, especially for people who are earlier on in their careers, which I would categorize myself into. It was very helpful for me to work at a more established sort of high compensation place for me to figure out like my personal life and like my way of work and like what I want or what I even am passionate about, because passion could be fleeting. It could come and go. And so for me to really explore different areas and then decide what I'm really passionate about, I think that takes time for a lot of people. Um, I mean, it's pretty obvious, but you only know what you're exposed to in life. And I think being more, being more susceptible or being more open to different ideas and different areas of things that you could work on allows you a better vantage point on deciding what your passion area is. If I were to choose, I would say kind of first kind of optimize maybe for like an established compensation package, and then think in the future about what you're passionate about.
That's great advice. I think for a lot of new entrepreneurs, they may not understand getting a crash course at a bigger company. You're going to learn soup to nuts about whatever you're passionate about, getting a steady paycheck, but giving you the chance to learn to then figure out what's your work-life balance for you personally.
Right.
Do you enjoy? How much do you spend in the office versus maybe doing it from home? Like those are the things that I think you should be asking yourself before jumping ahead and creating something for yourself. But at the same time, you did mention a lot about what was passionate for you. What was that passionate vision for Bezel, if you can say it in one sentence? And what is that
Mhm.
company vision for Bezel based on the passion for you personally?
Yeah, I think the overall vision is to empower people to really shape the world together. And what I mean by that is there's so many different 3D industries that could benefit from a collaborative tool like Bezel. And I see it expanding a lot beyond AR, VR as well. And so I think there's so many parts of different 3D industries and workflows where just having like a shared 3D space that you can jump into and like collaborate just like 10x's the speed of which the team can move. And on a more poetic note, I do think of the idea of having a sandcastle on the beach, where when you're at the beach building a sandcastle with your friends or family, it's a real time collaborative effort to build a 3D scene together. And it should feel like that to be collaborating on 3D projects together. But today, there just simply isn't a lot of tooling to enable that for people, regardless of whether it's for work or play. And I think that's the type of tooling that's required in the world.
That's super cool. Um, in terms of ensuring that everyone remains aligned to the company vision, how do you do it at Bezel?
Yeah, I'm still figuring it out. I'm not. I can't say I have the answer to fully aligning everyone at the company. I would say I try my best to share what I believe, and we do have a lot of tight sort of internal conversations around what's feasible, what the best opportunities would be for us to work on, and how this all lines up as stepping stones toward this ultimate vision over time. So I think, yeah, I'll have to get back to you on that in terms of a wise golden nugget I can share with you.
Cool. We'll check in again for the next episode. In terms of the competitive advantage of Bezel today, there's a lot of tools that I use within my production pipeline. Like I may, sketch something up in Gravity Sketch really quickly, and then I might go into Bezel to get, a little bit more fine tuned to kind of communicate what I'm trying to, the idea I'm trying to portray. With the rise of different XR and VR platforms, competition is increasing. What do you see sets Bezel apart from this potential competitors in the space?
Yeah, I think it's a couple things. I think for one, it's very difficult to build a good 3D editor or a good 3D design tool. Um, I mean, overall, like design software is very difficult to build. I think Figma took like 4 years for it to get to a public product that people could actually use. So I think from a competition standpoint, that automatically kind of has a higher sort of entry cost, I would say, to the field. Um, and like even after you start building it, you really have to have a clear vision of what the product is for, because 3D, I mean, it seems like a very uniform concept, but it's actually a huge umbrella of different subcategories within 3D. And you know, building a tool for sculpting or like 3D modeling is very different from like prototyping or like game design that you would make, right? So there's a wide array of things that you could focus on, and and as a startup, you kind of have to choose which way you want to go because you really can't tackle everything at once. So I think the path that Bezel's taking, which is more on the prototyping side, really aligns well with how the macro trends are moving, and how Bezel is paving the way forward for how people would work together in 3D. So yeah, and I think an open approach to just like integrating with different tools within that workflow, like whether it's Figma or Unity, we have a pretty open integration approach to making sure that Bezel works well with people's existing tools as well. So yeah, I think it's all these things combined.
Yeah, I think it's all of those things combined using the tools that are right for you, but it's also we're creating the language and the workflows that are going to be most efficient in spatial computing, right? That's the bottom line.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
with spatial computing, there's just so much happening in this space. What are your predictions, Julian, for the next 5 years, and how will Bezel adopt to those changes?
I think for the next 5 years, if I were to be a bit speculative, I would say that the Vision product line from Apple could replace a lot of desktop screens. So currently, a lot of desktop setups have like a laptop and also a connected like monitor that has a larger screen usually. But I think a lot of these things, like the larger monitor especially, can just go away if the Vision Pro can be an ultimate screen that fills up your whole peripheral. Um, and from what I can tell, the visual quality of the Vision Pro is also so high that it feels like an actual screen in front of you. So from that point, I think a lot of people will start to use the headset at home for work, and that's going to have a lot of implications, second and third order to day-to-day life. But I kind of see that being more practical over the next 5 years or so, while people, still carrying around their phones. And I think the next 10, 15 years, we would be able to see a more mass adoption of like AR glasses, which is sort of the ultimate form factor that a lot of people talk about.
So is Bezel really focusing on the multi-screen use case? The reason why I'm interested in that, when I was at the first Meta, that's where Facebook had bought the name. We were working on the Meta 4, which is a 90-degree field of view, really wide, resolution headset. Basically, everything you're seeing for the Quest Pro basically was the Meta 4.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people working on that transitioned over to Meta, but I've interviewed probably 200 of the Fortune 500 companies trying to find out what that use case was for an AR headset like the original Meta. And I had a lot of assumptions like, hey, it'll probably be split between different verticals like AEC, architecture, engineering, construction. They'd probably be into 3D visualization. And, for finance, it would probably be multi-screen, those type of use cases. But anyways, after interviewing all these companies, one thing that came about was people just wanted more monitors because a lot of these Fortune 500 companies knew the direct savings that it would cost for an employee to be more proficient and more effective by just having multiple screens. You can actually put a cost to that. So that was actually the killer use case. And those are the questions that we would ask from the product side. Like, okay, well, now what do we do with this? Like if it's just about multiple screens, and then open up a plethora of other ideas. Like, well, what if you interacted with those screens and you actually had a 3D modeler that you can pull out from one of those screens and then see it collaboratively together? And a lot of things that Meta transitioned into Campfire, which is what it is now, and they're actually really honing in on that idea. But with multi-screens, do you see that as kind of a feature that you can incorporate for Bezel, like with some of those ideas that I had provided, being part of the work stream for the Bezel platform?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think a lot of the devices we use today assume that the device has one screen, and that has a lot of implications on how the product is used. But I think once the door opens up so that designers and creators can decide how these multi-screen workflows look like and how they work together, I think that's a whole new world of innovation that would happen. And I think more than anything, the real trigger point that really changes people's perception on these multi-screen use cases is really pixel density. So like as we've seen with the Vision OS demos, I do think pixel density is the kicker that determines whether a screen even is usable when it's rendered in front of you. And if it's too blurry or the text, the 12-point fonts are a little too blurry to read, then it's not really a screen. It looks like a screen. It's not an actual screen. So I think that is the difference that we will have to continue to navigate around. And hopefully it does seem like with recent hardware advancements, that is where we're getting to more and more. So I do think it is a timing thing, but with the hardware as well as the product.
Where do you think that the timing becomes mass market? I think what people fail to understand, the Apple Vision Pro is a dev kit, right? It's meant for developers to spark that interest. But in order for it to be ubiquitous, we already know that even the Quest 3 has done strides. They've take that monumental leap where it was really comfortable. Like I tried it on at Meta Connect. I'm like, yeah, I can see myself now
Hmm.
wearing this for an additional 2 hours. That's how I kind of like lay out in terms of how frequently I would be using this technology until it just gets a little bit too heavy, just like anything on your face. When do you think we are get to that form factor where it's ubiquitous, to where it's a pair of glasses, like what they're trying to do with Ray-Bans, but they also have a visual component? When do we get there, Julian?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of um, quality info there on internal timelines from. I mean, because it depends
Just
so
you
much
taking a
on
swag on
Apple.
it.
Yeah, maybe like 6 years,
Yeah,
6 7 years.
yeah.
I think.
Two iterations, two generations
Yeah,
after. Yeah.
I think so. Because even with something like the iPhone, I believe it really took off after like iPhone 3, 4, in terms of adoption. Um, I don't think it's going to be much different here in terms of making sure the device could iterate towards more mass adoption properties. And these things really take off when they take off. When it becomes part of pop culture, when people talk about it more in the media, I think that's when it really becomes part of people seeing it, using it day to day. But yeah, but like I said, I think it depends so much on these sort of big tech players' internal timelines too. So we'll see how it plays out.
That makes total sense. In terms of those capabilities, there are some of the advice that you did give for entrepreneurs. There are some uncertainties. There's some risks involved to different platforms and different headsets. For people who are thinking about jumping in as an entrepreneur into VR, what advice do you give for them?
Hmm. I would say building a startup is really hard. And saying that it's really hard might actually be an understatement because all the external variables are lined up against you because the world doesn't, or at least the incumbents, they don't want more startup disruption, right? Like it's just not what the structure of society has been built for. So I think trying to make sure that every variable possible is aligned to your advantage or to your benefit when working on something new is crucial. So what that means is, for example, not really jumping into a whole new field that you're not fully familiar with. Of course, it's possible, but chances are someone else in that field have a head start and like the knowledge and the sort of the insider info required to build a unique product. I think there's also things around like hiring, and because I mean, there's only so much that one person can do. It really has to be a team effort. So in order to hire and recruit, you also need a compelling product idea. So I think it really is true that if you are starting something new, it's easier to start with a more ambitious and crazier idea than to say, oh, we're gonna build something that we already know of and we can easily imagine because, well, you're gonna face a lot of competition. It's gonna be difficult to recruit people. You're gonna need a lot more explaining to differentiate and like go into a rabbit hole of micro features. And I think just taking a step back and kind of the hockey puck analogy, right? It's just like, okay, where will the future be in several years? What do I know best in my field and my passion areas, and how do I align that so that it all works together? I think that's what needs to happen.
That's great advice. In terms of the challenges in the VR industry, from a new CEO's perspective in VR, what are the current VR challenges as an industry, and how do they need to be addressed?
Yeah, I think in terms of challenges, I think we mentioned this briefly, but just the friction point to get into a session and to stay there for a long time. Um, I do believe that as the hardware evolves, we'll get better and better over time. But just today, it's really difficult because when you're competing against people's time, especially for consumer products, you're really competing against people scrolling on their Instagram or Twitter feeds, or people just watching a Netflix show on their computer, right? It's like people's time, it's 24 hours and very limited. And it to compel someone to put on a headset is a whole nother level of activation energy that is always going to um, play a role into how well people can adopt your product. So I would really think about that aspect. It's like, what is the unique value prop that your product is offering that beats the activation energy to put on a headset?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest problems as an industry that we face. You would think that with the evolution of the phone, and I really hope that Apple and Meta really does this, but we already know how quickly to interact from a 2D interface. It would be great to just to press a button and then you put on your headset and there you go. I've told the story at the last interview at Meta Connect. It took several minutes just to even get onboarded into the headset for a demo, right? And we're all industry veterans. It should just be plug and play. But that's just the state that we're in as an industry. But that barrier, like you've probably experienced this trying to give demos at home of someone in VR, it just takes forever. Lastly, how do you see Bezel in the next couple of years, especially with this continuous advancement in VR? Where do you make a prediction?
Yeah, I think Bezel's vision is to really accelerate and shorten the time between someone having an idea for something and creating that in 3D that can then be shared with other people. So it's having an imaginary thought of like, this is an app I want to build, this is a game I want to build, this is a scene that I want to paint or just kind of have sketched out in front of me, and then getting from there to an actual 3D scene as fast as possible, but also not stopping there, and also allowing a space for the broader team to work and iterate on top of. And I think that's the overall goal of Bezel, is just to allow people to go from idea to reality. And the term reality might reflect differently for different people here, but go from idea to reality as fast as possible.
That's cool. Julian, I had such a great time talking to you.
Yeah,
Where
likewise.
can people find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn. You can search my name. I'll be there. You could also join our Discord community, which we have for Bezel, bezel.it/community. And you can find it on our website. So yeah, I would love to just have people join us, share more feedback, ask more questions, and that also allows us to build a better product for everyone in this space. So
Julian, thank you so much. I hope you have a great week.
awesome. Yeah, you too. Thank you.
Thanks.